And stress has really got a bad name. The reality is, stress is actually important. It may be a headache, neck soreness, shoulder soreness, a backache. They could feel it in their heart, they could feel it in their chest, they could feel it everywhere. Now, I've sort of broken it down into 3 reasons why I believe this happens. And the first one would be our expectations, which then leads us to the second point of what happens when our expectations aren't met. And that comes down to the story we tell ourselves. And then finally, it leads to the thinking patterns. As I've just said, the thinking patterns is really the glue in this whole portion because of the fact that you continue to run this reel of thinking the way you do. How much stress do you feel, or you feel you're under right now? How do you actually define it? How do you gauge it? And where do you feel it in your body? Now, if you're new to this show, my name is Doctor Gan, and here I discuss topics on biohacking, longevity, as well as performance in health. Now, for many people, these questions about stress are not really thought about. They never really think about it in terms of defining what that stress means to them. And oftentimes, it's almost a segue of feeling quite overwhelmed and feeling this heaviness that they feel all around as a result of feeling stress. Now, the most important thing I would say here would be, for everyone, it can be different, but you have to identify where you feel this stress, because for some people, it may be a headache. For others, it might be neck soreness, shoulder soreness, a backache. They could feel it in their heart. They could feel it in their chest. They could feel it everywhere. And obviously, if you're feeling it in places, for example, around your shoulders or your chest, just make sure that you're not having a medical event such as a heart attack that can sometimes precipitate itself in extremes when people are having stress. Now, when you actually break it down, there are different varying amounts of stress, and stress has really got a bad name. The reality is, stress is actually important. And let me explain how. Now, when you were young, and I'm going through this with my son, so it kind of feels like it goes hand in hand. When you're learning to write or you're learning how to read, this can be quite challenging. And mentally, this is a stress because you don't know what you don't know, and you're trying to work out what is new, and it hasn't really been in your environment. And for this reason, mentally, this can actually stress you. Now, again, if you're trying to get in shape and you're trying to lose weight, or you're trying to build muscle and get ripped, again, you're going from a state of what you're not to what you want to be. And again, there can be physical stress in terms of converting that state physically in your body and having that body that is ripped and that you feel comfortable in. In both cases, whether it be mental and physical stress, it is actually quite important in order for you to actually grow, to have healthy amounts of stress and also have a healthy response to that stress on how you actually handle it. Now, what I've found personally, and also with a lot of people that I've seen over the years, is that the way they respond to the stress is usually what gets them into trouble. The WHO defines stress as a state of worry or mental tension caused by a difficult situation. Now, for most people, we may go through difficult situations every day. For example, your car's not starting, you have unrealistic workload at work, you have job insecurity, it might be financial as well, it could be a relationship breakup. These are big events, but there's always the smaller ones, like hurting yourself on the way to work, or even getting stuck in traffic and being late to work. And you can add on to the list almost a new event that happens that wasn't really expected. So why do some people really manage stress well and others tend to struggle with the whole concept of often feeling quite overwhelmed and feeling like everything is quite hard? Now, I've sort of broken it down into 3 reasons why I believe this happens. And it is not the common reason that you're going to think, but it is a little bit unconventional. But I've spent a lot of time thinking about why I believe this to be true. And the first one would be our expectations. Now, every time you have a goal, whether it is to lose weight or to get a role at work or to go on holidays or to have the lifestyle that you want, you're setting an expectation for yourself to achieve it. No one sets a goal thinking, maybe I'll do it. It's not that important, but I'm going to put it in the on sort of my horizon. Most of the time when you're setting a goal, especially if it's important to you, there is a expectation that you place on yourself. And I have found, especially with high achievers, when they feel that the expectation is not met, and oftentimes you will feel that a lot because you just feel you're not making progress, you can often feel this sense of overwhelm or heaviness that tends to come because of the expectation, which then leads us to the second point of what happens when our expectations aren't met. And that comes down to the story we tell ourselves. Now, if you've set yourself a goal and you haven't reached that expectation because you expected to get that, or you expected to get that job, or you even expected to achieve that goal in a certain time and you haven't hit it, you then create a story. Now, the story is what kind of gives the expectations meaning. And so you create the story that I failed to do this. I failed to lose weight. I failed to get that role. I failed to financially hit that number. And the story is how you build it into your life. So if you fail in something, then the next part of that story is I'm a failure. What if people find out that I'm not that good? You create that imposter syndrome, which, to be honest, I've had that multiple times in my career and also in my life. And then you have other stories of maybe I'm just not good enough. Maybe I can't do it. Maybe I'm doing the wrong thing. Maybe I should do something else. There's so many maybes, but this is the inbuilt story based on the expectations. And then finally, it leads to the thinking patterns. As I've just said in the last couple of minutes, when I came down to expectation and your story, the thinking patterns is really the glue in this whole portion, because of the fact that you continue to run this reel of thinking the way you do. So, for example, you set yourself up for an expectation of getting something, and then you don't achieve it, and then you create a story behind it, and then there's a thinking pattern on what makes that story real. So, if, for example, you set yourself up to lose weight, but you didn't achieve it, then you create a story that maybe you didn't work hard enough. And then this is the thinking pattern that just continues to almost diminish yourself and feel like you're not good enough. And so you got the expectation, you got the story, and then you got your thinking pattern. So the trifecta would be having a high expectation, having a story that you did not achieve it, and then having a thinking pattern where you're not going to be good enough to ever do it and you should not even try. Now, again, some people in positive psychology or even in psychology may say that that is sort of negative thinking. But if you actually peel it back to most people, we're running these thoughts every day and all the time. And especially when we're listening to different videos or audio or even talking to different people, there's always that comparison of one is better than the other. And then it always makes the idea that you're not good enough a reality, because you're just trying to get feedback from the outside to let you know that your story is valid, and also to let you know that the thinking patterns that you have, this is another reason why I couldn't achieve that. This is another reason why I couldn't do it, just plays a big role. Now, I know this is not conventional. And again, you might be thinking, how is this related to my stress? But believe me, I am going to link it. And I'm also going to tell you ways of how you can actually reduce your stress if you actually think about the structure of what your expectations are, what the story you tell yourself, and eventually the thinking pattern. So now that you know that this is potentially what is causing stress, when you actually peel all the layers back, how can you actually change this? Or more so, how can you improve your life in a way to handle stress? Now, I've tried everything out there in terms of stress reduction because I'm a recovering chronic stressor. And to be honest, I don't think you ever really get out of it. You just manage the way you think about stress and you manage the way you go through it. And you put in little pillars to control yourself from getting overly stressed or even overwhelmed. Now, the common things which I have been sort of harping on all these episodes has been doing the basics. So I'm not going to mention those because everyone knows that the basics is what you need. So the basics of nutrition, the basics of movement, the basics of taking care of your mind with mindfulness or meditation practices, and also the basics of essentially having a community of people to talk to, or even having someone to talk to, whether that be a psychologist, a counselor, or someone that you trust. Today, I'm not going to mention those as a focus point on the areas that will help with your stress. I'm actually going to think out a little bit out of the box because I feel for most people, you could be meditating, you could be eating well, you could also have a real positive mindset and, you know, have certain mantras that you say to yourself when you're in a tough situation, but somehow breaking out of that crux where you feel when you're in that moment of feeling really overwhelmed and stressed. I just think that the best way to actually get to this is by going a little bit deeper. So the first option I have in terms of how do you break out of this cycle is to have the awareness. Now, when I say awareness, most people think that, yes, I know I'm stressed. Yes, I know that this is happening. But when you actually really look at it, most people that are quite stressed, they only feel the stress when they hit the point where they've hit their threshold. So for some people, their threshold might be this small, whereby once they hit that threshold, they kind of feel, I'm feeling stressed right now. For others, it could take them a long time before they hit it, which is also a reason why many people who have burnout and the moment they recognize their burnout have probably been burnt out for weeks, even months before they hit that point. They basically just tipped over the scales and hit that critical point, which is when they personally feel like they're burnt out, where their energy is low and they just feel like nothing is good in their life. And eventually they kind of hit that point where they don't want to do it anymore. And so if you have the awareness to note for yourself how you feel on a daily basis, and if that's hard, even looking at it from a weekly basis, this will give you a gauge of where you're sitting. And I tend to do this potentially daily, but sometimes I miss those days because I have big days. And I look at it from a weekly perspective to see how stressed was I mentally, what was my frame of mind, and also what was I doing if I was actually mentally well and not feeling stressed. What was the difference there? So I'm always looking at ways to improve and look at levels of where I am so that I can essentially gauge which direction I'm going. Now, if I've had a big week and it has been a challenging week for various reasons, whether it be work or even family or personal reasons, then I can sort of put it down at the end of the week. These are the reasons I had a bad week. These are the reasons I felt the stress. These are the things I did to improve the stress. And if I can't improve it because the week is just the way it is, these are some of the stop points that helped me during the week and what I can do for the next week to get a bit better. I like to optimize myself on a daily basis and also a weekly basis. Now, it's not possible to just spend your time optimizing, and I'm not saying you spend a lot of time, but essentially, you could almost spend a couple of minutes, and this could be a huge difference, even on that drive home if you're driving, or maybe that evening walk when you take, which you just, it's all about sort of getting your thoughts together and getting that time to step back and look at what's happening. And I feel that really helps in terms of one of the first solutions and how to handle your stress. The next one would be do less to have more. There have been different versions of this, be more, do more, have more. I've actually kind of consolidated to become do less and have more. And the reason I say this is that most people would know that oftentimes when you go on holiday, when you're feeling relaxed, that is when you come up with the best ideas. That is when things that were challenging before become very clear. And oftentimes, to have clarity, you have to give yourself space to relax, and you have to have that space to be able to think clearly rather than try to make decisions when you're often busy and life is in the way. Now, for most people that are in professions where they're making tough decisions every day and they're just busy with a lot of operations and other things that are happening in their work, oftentimes having this space to think is quite challenging. And you may feel that you're making the best decisions, but realistically, you might only be making decisions at a 60 to 70% capacity because you're actually quite tired, because you're making it on the go, on the fly, and you're probably not making the best decisions. So creating a bit of space so that you can think clearly and make better decisions will allow you to actually have more by actually doing less. And oftentimes when I float this idea, most people are kind of outraged because they feel like maybe for you, because, you have the time, maybe for this person, because, they have time to do this they run their business and they're not really in their business and they have the time to think about it. But for most people, even though you might be in it or you might be in a position where you're that busy, you have to give yourself time. And this could be the walk at the end of the day. It could be a walk in the morning. It could be um, in the evening, just before you go to bed, for you to just settle your thoughts and to have a little bit of thinking space to think about your decisions for the week that you're going to make, and also especially the big decisions and not the everyday decisions. And I tend to find that during the morning, that's when I have my best ideas, and that's when I'm fresh after a big day. And I cut myself or give myself time to be able to think a little bit more. And potentially even when I exercise in the morning, I kind of get that clarity, and it just makes me feel good because I feel like I'm in control in that moment, and also in control of my decisions that I'm going to make that is going to affect my next week, next month, and even the year. The next one would be find your balancing act. Now, this would tie in with a lot of basic stuff, but again, it comes down to awareness. For most people, the balancing act that I'm talking about would be their hobby that they have. For some, it would be reading. For others, it would be going out surfing, maybe kayaking. Maybe it could be a run. Maybe it could be out in the woods or in nature. Everyone has that little balancing act that makes them feel good. For others, it could be writing. For me, it's a mixture of reading and being out in nature and exercising. But everyone knows this, even especially at home, with my wife often telling me that if I'm feeling stressed or I'm feeling out of sync, and she's noticed it, she would often not tell me to go out for a run or do something of that nature, because that is my balancing act, and that actually makes me feel better. And now there are a lot of people that do this. I know a lot of high performing um, athletes and also high performing people at work who often have exercise or movement as a way to be their balancing act. And they often feel better for it. They feel a lot more clear. They have a lot more ideas, and they feel a lot more balanced. And for you, what tends to happen is the busier you get or the more stress you get, you often have that pattern of thinking whereby you convince yourself you don't actually have the time to do it. So you convince yourself, I don't have time to go for that run that I used to love and I actually enjoy and it makes me feel better. I just don't have time for it. I don't have time to exercise. I don't have time to read because I've got to do all these other things. Now, that would open up a can of worms whereby we'd be talking about time management, which is a very essential skill to have. But besides that, when you're stressed, you often make poor decisions. And because of that recurrent thinking pattern, the story you're telling yourself that probably not good enough, probably not working hard enough, you then start to almost avoid the things that got you there in the first place and also made you happy. So find your balancing act, whatever that may be, and ensure that you prioritize it and put in your calendar, whether daily or weekly, so that you know that that is going to keep you in that place where you feel you actually have control of what is happening, and in your mind you feel a lot more balanced. Next, we have rest. Now, this is boring, I know, and telling someone that's quite stressed or is in this repeated pattern of feeling overwhelmed that you need to rest is almost a waste of time telling someone this because they will feel that they're not going to improve. But I put this probably around the fourth point because of the fact that by actually resting, you're giving yourself time to energize, to rejuvenate. And oftentimes, rest can make a huge difference on how stressed you feel, which is also part of the reason why when you have a good night's sleep, no matter how bad the day was or how big the day was for you, after you had a good night's sleep, you often feel a lot better the next morning. Now, if you're not feeling better the next morning, it could be the fact that you didn't get proper sleep, or it could be that you're not eating well, or potentially you could have already hit the point where you're actually feeling burnt out. So again, the awareness factor that I mentioned earlier is very important. Since I mentioned something boring such as rest, now we're going to go into the challenging territory of things that would help make the biggest difference when it comes to your stress. And that is changing your story. Now, this is very challenging because for most people, they don't realize that they're running this story. And for me, it was the same. I always thought that the things that got me to where I am is what I need to continue. And so part of that was telling myself that I'm very hardworking. I might not be the smartest person. And again, this was my story because it kind of pushed me to work harder. It pushed me to limits where I thought I needed to do more in order to get more. And it was very unhealthy because I even told myself that I wasn't that smart and that it was potentially my hard work that really got me there. And in some ways, it did help me, but to an extent until that story didn't really work. And so, for that reason, kind of uncovering your story is something that you need to do either personally by journaling or spending time trying to work out what are the patterns that come in your mind or the story that you tell yourself. And I think for a lot of high performing people, they have this drive that keeps pushing them, and it's really hard to work out where it's coming from, but it often pushes them to do really hard things, and sometimes to the point where you're mentally exhausting yourself by thinking too much, and also sometimes to the point where you're physically exhausting yourself because you're reaching that point feeling that you're going to push yourself more than anyone else. Now, a story comes to mind about Kobe Bryant, and he generally pushed himself feeling that same way, whereby he felt he wasn't talented enough. He didn't have the skill set to do what some of the most talented basketball players did. For example, Michael Jordan at that time. And so he pushed himself by working out harder, by practicing more, and just there was a continuous onslaught of just pushing himself to the limits. Now, when you pull the curtains and you look behind, you may think that that's what made him amazing or just a legend, but it came at a toll or a sacrifice to his family or to his body as well because he pushed himself to that limit. So I'm not saying that the story that you tell yourself is of pushing yourself is not a good one, but at some point it becomes unhealthy, and you sort of have to work out whether maybe this story worked for you at some point, and maybe a new story may be a better option rather than continuing with the story that you've always had. And if you're pushing yourself and you're trying to achieve certain things, that is one element. But for some people, the story could be, I'm always going to be a failure. I'm never going to do anything good in my life. Or this is the way it is. And I'm just going to rely on what has been. And hopefully things would be different for me in the future. So if you change your story, you may be able to change your stress. One of the things I find helps that many people probably don't believe in or feel that they're useless is sometimes having some positive affirmations. Now, the reason I think they're useful is not the same reasons why some people believe positive affirmations are amazing. I think it's useful because when you repeat to yourself something that I am not what I do, or I'm smart and I'm whole, or anything that helps you, what you're essentially doing is reminding yourself, especially when your thinking pattern is trying to run back into that place where I'm not good enough, and you're breaking that mold. So it's almost a mirror that you're looking into and you're repeating to yourself. And obviously, when I say mirror, you're not looking in a mirror, but is almost that reflection that it gives you when you have these positive affirmations, and it's breaking that mold of what you've always had running in the back of your mind. So if you keep reminding yourself, you will eventually break that mold and eventually essentially get to the point where your story can change. Now, with anyone trying this, it will take a long time because that story is ingrained. You can potentially change it quickly, but you have to give yourself some time because it doesn't happen immediately. And once you start, you might feel that you actually don't believe in what you're saying, and you also actually don't believe that this new story is what you are. So deep down, you might feel that you are a failure, but you're trying to change your story, and you just don't believe in it yet. But persevere and you will get there. Finally, the next one I think would help you greatly would be practice being present. Again, this is a huge struggle. I still struggle with it every day, but it is something that I feel I've got to a point that I'm getting better at. And what I mean by this is that there's been tons of books out there. The Power of Now, I think Eckhart Tolle, and a lot of other authors that have spoken about being present. But the reality is you have to bring that into your world. And being present doesn't mean that you're actually somewhere with your family and thinking about work. Now that is the obvious part when people think about being present, but I'm actually getting even more detailed about being present in terms of when you have that moment where even at work, where you either at your desk or you're walking between meetings or you're walking between talking to someone and going back to your room, these are moments where you can almost switch off and be present to where you are, how you feel, the sensations in your body, and just be in that moment. And oftentimes, what I do is I actually repeat to myself that I'm free in this moment. And I find that really helps me because it almost liberates me that no matter how hard the day is, no matter how many challenges I'm having, in that 1 to 2 seconds that I'm in that moment and I notice my breath, or I notice how I feel, or I notice my muscles, or I notice my body in different forms. I'm just being present in that moment. And it might only be 2 or 3 seconds. It might be 5 seconds. It might be 20 seconds that you allow yourself to just kind of feel that. So I'm not actually asking you to stop your day just to have this moment of presence, but I'm asking you to actually allow yourself to be free in that moment when you're in these couple of seconds that you allow yourself. And the more you do it, the more you will feel that there's a disconnect between the expectations that you have, between your thinking patterns, between the story that you've been telling yourself. And especially one like you are not what you do. Again, that disconnects you to be completely free, that you could be any place or anywhere you want, but you are right there where you are and just being happy in that moment. So to conclude, there are different forms of stress. There's good stress and there's also bad stress. But it's important to note that you do not want to avoid stress. You don't want to be comfortable because it's in that mix of healthy stress and responding to that healthy stress that you have the biggest amount of growth. Now, when it comes to exercise and even moving, you can have unhealthy stress physically pushing your body whereby you have injuries and you reach a point whereby you're not recovered enough. And again, this just because exercise or movement is a good thing, it doesn't mean that in terms of the stress on your body, it is a good thing as well. So you have to manage even your physical stress as much as you manage your mental stress. Overthinking as well is not a good thing and often leads to excessive stress as a result of always thinking of the worst thing to happen. And finally, there's expectations. The moment you release your expectations, you will feel a lot better because it takes the pressure off you to know that no matter what you're doing, you are doing the daily work to get there. And if you don't get there, that's okay as well. And that's a really hard pill to swallow, especially when you want something really badly and you have the expectations of it working out and it doesn't happen. But letting yourself that, or giving yourself that leeway or that space that it's okay if it doesn't, something else good will happen, is one way to think about it. Now, on my next episode, I will be talking about meditation and especially the different forms and how you could basically incorporate it into your life, even if you have a busy schedule. Now, if you enjoy this episode, please don't forget to like or subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or even Apple Podcasts, and share it with someone you feel would benefit from listening to this show. Until I catch you next time, speak soon.